Hello, good afternoon. Today we're going to be talking about the early works in cognitive psychology. And before we get into it, we're just going to briefly talk about what the mind is and give a definition of what the mind is. The mind refers to an intangible cognitive and subconscious or conscious aspect of human experience, including thoughts, emotions, perceptions, memories, attention, language, deciding, thinking, and reasoning. So basically, what that means is that the mind is basically the hub for perception, where language comes from conscious and subconscious experiences of human living. That's basically what the mind is. So we've gone ahead and we've defined the mind. So when it comes to the early works in cognitive psychology, we're basically going to be looking at six guys, and their names are Donder, Wundt, Ebbinghaus, William James, John Watson, and then Skinner operant condition. So those are like the five aspects of the early works in cognitive psychology that we're going to be discussing today. And the first one that we're going to be talking about is the Donders pioneering experiment. So Donders pioneering experiment. That's the first thing we're going to talk about today. And the major aspect of the Donders pioneering experiment that we're going to be talking about today is going to include mental chronometry, reaction time experiment, subtractive method, and the stages of processing. So we might actually ask ourselves or wonder what this experiment is all about, or who done that is safe in the first place. So basically, this experiment was carried out in 1868. So it's called the Donders experiment or Donders pioneer experiment in 1868. And in this time, he introduced the concept of mental chronometry, which was an attempt to study how the mind works and all of that. So this experiment happened like 11 years before the first laboratory was introduced in Leipzig, Germany. So Donders, 1868. Let's get into it. So the name of the pioneer of this experiment is called Franciscus Donders. Franciscus Donders, and 1868 was the year in which this experiment was carried out. He was a Dutch psychologist, and he introduced the idea that mental processes can be scientifically studied and quantified. So you will remember that um, William Wundt was the one that did the whole laboratory experiment in Leipzig, Germany. So before then, there have not been any kinds of experiment to try and study how the mind works and all of that. So Donder was one of the first guys that attempted to scientifically study the mind. So in his experiment, he introduced the subtractive method, and in subtractive method, there he was trying to um, different experimental conditions or different experimental tasks in order to measure mental processing or cognitive processing. So, what did he try to do in his subtractive method? He was basically trying to he was basically making reaction time the dependent variable to studying mental processes. And what does that mean? It means that he was calculating the reaction time. So it's more like it would give a stimuli to the participants and then calculate the reaction time it took them to respond to that stimuli. So it had like four experimental conditions, which was the simple task, the choice task. Sorry, three experimental conditions, not four, three of them. The simple task, the choice task, and the go no go task. So we're going to talk more about that when we get to the subtractive method. But let's first start with mental chronometry and what idea it represents. So we know that Franciscus Donders in 1868 introduced the idea that the mind can be scientifically studied and quantified. Then he focused on measuring the time course it took for a mental process to happen. He focused on measuring the time course, meaning reaction time, the time it took for mental processes to occur. And that whole sentence we just mentioned now is what mental chronometry is all about. So, what can we define mental chronometry about? We can say that it's a field where we measure the time course it takes for processes to occur. So we're going to say that it's a field where we measure the time course it takes for mental processes to occur. That's what mental chronometry means. All right. So in Donner's experiment, one of the key insights that he got was that by measuring reaction time under different conditions, we could infer the duration of specific cognitive processes. So what he was saying was that when you measure the reaction time of different conditions, we could basically select it and say that okay, this is the time it takes, or this is the time it takes for a cognitive process to happen. So I think in his experiment, he concluded that it takes 1/10 of a second for a decision to be made. That's what he got to find out through his experiment. So let's talk about the subtractive method because we've already talked about mental chronometry. Okay, let's just go because the reaction time measurement is very similar to the subtractive method. Subtractive method is just basically the experiment. It's like a technique for isolating and measuring the time taken for uh by individual stages of mental processing. So the subtractive method is a technique for isolating and measuring the time taken by individual stages of mental processing. So it's the same experiment, the reaction time measurement, that brought about the subtractive method. So the subtractive method was a technique where he was trying to measure the time it took for individual stages of processing, of mental processing to occur. All right. So what is reaction time before we even go ahead to talk about reaction time measurement and the subtractive method? Reaction time is the time between the presentation of a stimuli and the initiation of a response. So what is reaction time? Reaction time is the time it takes for somebody to see a stimuli and then react to that stimuli. So for example now, if you want to pick between a pear and an apple, they are both seated on the table and you want to say okay, you want to pick one of them, the time it takes for you to recognize those stimuli, that the stimuli is being the apple and the pear, and the time it now takes for you to pick one of them is the reaction time. So that's basically what reaction time is all about. So Donders used the reaction time as a dependent variable to study cognitive processes. He designed experiments where participants were asked to respond to stimuli in different ways, and he measured how long it took for them to do so. So in Donders' experiment, he basically asked participants to respond to stimuli in different ways, and then he measured the time it took for them to do so, meaning to respond to that stimuli. You remember that we mentioned that reaction time means that the time it takes for you to perceive a stimuli and then respond to that stimuli. All right. So let's just dive into the subtractive method. So, like I earlier said, I said that Donders basically had three experimental conditions and three experimental tasks that he gave participants. So, in the first task, it's called the simple reaction time task. And in the simple reaction time task, basically, what was asking them to do was that they should press the button as soon as possible, meaning that when they recognize a stimuli, they should press the button. So, for example, if a green light was in front of them, it says, okay, the moment that green light comes up, you should press the button and say that, okay, I have seen this stimuli and I can recognize the stimuli. So in all of those tasks, there were certain things that he was trying to measure or certain processes within that task that he was trying to measure. So for the simple reaction task, it was mostly detection and then motor execution. So detection and motor execution when it comes to the simple reaction task, because in the simple reaction task, his participants were just mainly responding to a stimuli. So I hope we're getting it. So his participants were just mostly responding to a stimuli in the simple reaction task. So basically, in that point, he was trying to measure the stimulus detection or perception, and then motor response or motor execution. Meaning, okay, when I see it, I press. When I see the green light, I press the button. That's what he was trying to do in the simple reaction task. So in the choice reaction task, which is the second task, it was a little bit different because in this point, he introduced another concept of called deciding or decision, also known as response selection. So in the reaction choice task or in the choice reaction time task, it introduced another cognitive process called deciding or response selection. That was the cognitive process that he introduced in the choice reaction time task. So in this choice reaction time task, it was basically like he gave the participant two stimuli, and then he said, okay, when you see one stimuli, respond to this. When you see another stimuli, respond to that. So how it worked was that, let's say we now have a green and a red light. So he says that, okay, when you see the red light, press your right button. When you see the green light, press the left button. So that's basically how he introduced the cognitive task of um, response selection, also known as deciding. So in the choice reaction time task, he introduced the cognitive process of deciding or response selection. So we will know that for this particular task, it was now a thing where the participant had to detect the stimuli called detection and then or perception, and then they now had to go on to discriminate the stimuli, meaning that they had to say, okay, is this red or green? Which one is red, which one is green? That is called stimulus and discrimination. So they went on, they first decided, then they went on to discriminate the stimuli, and then they now went on to deciding, which is the response selection, and then they went on to motor execution. So let me explain that more briefly so that we get it. The point is that for the choice reaction time task, which is the second experimental condition, in the choice reaction time task, he introduced more introduce more cognitive processes. And what are those cognitive processes? You remember that in the simple reaction time task, he was basically just saying that it was stimulus detection and motor execution. But when it comes to the choice reaction time task, it was now four processes, four cognitive processes that was happening. So in that choice reaction time task, he introduced stimulus perception, which is the recognizing the stimulus, the stimulus, and then he introduced discrimination, which is now choosing like, okay, discrimination is now recognizing that, okay, this stimuli is red and this stimuli is green. That's what discrimination was basically talking about. So in the choice reaction time test, it was now four cognitive processes: detection or perception, um, discrimination, deciding, and then motor execution. So we should also know that deciding can also be called stimulus. Sorry, deciding can also be called response selection, and discrimination can also be called stimulus discrimination. They're also the same thing. So let's not forget, for the choice reaction time task, we have detection, stimulus discrimination, response selection, and then motor execution. So we should also know that another name for deciding is response selection. Another name for discrimination is stimulus discrimination. So you can use them interchangeably or just use both of them to explain the concept much better. So that's what the reaction time task was all about. Then for the third experimental condition, it was called the go no go task. And in the go no go task, what Donders was asking his participants to do was that they should respond to only one stimuli. So two stimuli are going to be presented to them, but they're only allowed to respond to one stimuli. So for example, now it can say that, okay, when the right lamp comes on, don't respond. But when the left lamp comes up, respond. So in that situation, it was removing one cognitive load away from it. So remember that in the choice task, it was four cognitive processes. Four cognitive processes. But in the go to no go task, it was removing one condition, one cognitive task away from it, and it was removing the time taken for them to make a decision, because in this case they are just discriminating the stimuli. They are going to perceive the stimuli, which is the detection, and then they are now going to discriminate the stimuli, and then they are now going to have a motor execution. I hope we're getting it. So let me just try to come more slowly. So we have the go to no go task, which is that in that experiment, Donders was basically saying that, you see, you're going to see a red lamp. So you're going to see a right lamp and a left lamp. When the right lamp comes on, do not do anything. But once that left lamp comes on, respond and press the button. That's basically what that part of the go to no go tax experiment was talking about. So how exactly did Donders now calculate the reaction times from all of these tasks? You remember that in the first simple task, we only had two cognitive processes. In the second choice reaction task, we had four cognitive processes. And then in the go to no go task, we had three cognitive processes. Okay? So how it was trying to, okay, before we even move on to that, we should also note that in the go to no go task, what he was trying to do there was response inhibition. response inhibition. So when he says that, okay, the participant should not press anything when a particular lamp comes on, and then they should press something when the second one comes on, he was trying to inhibit a response. So that's also called response inhibition. All right. So we know that for the go to no go task, the three cognitive processes, or the three cognitive processes that were introduced was detection, discrimination, and motor execution, compared to the choice reaction task where four cognitive processes were introduced, which was detection, discrimination, deciding, and motor execution. And then in the simple reaction time task, only two cognitive processes were introduced, which is deciding and motor execution. So how did Donder now come about this time measurement? How did he now measure the time taken for each cognitive task to be performed? So what he did was that he kind of like isolated the time. And what does that mean? It means that for the first time it takes for the first simple task, that one was very simple. The time it takes for the participant to perceive the stimuli and then respond to the stimuli, that just clearly tells us what the reaction time is and what time it takes for that decision to be made or for that stimuli to be perceived. But when you went to the next time, the next task, which was the choice, the um so the next one, where okay, we have two cognitive processes, three cognitive processes, and then four cognitive processes. So the two cognitive processes, which was the simple task, it was easy to measure that one, how long it took for participants to respond to that stimuli, to detect it and then respond to that stimuli. So for the three cognitive processes, which was the go to no go task, it was more like it now added the time. So for example, now it calculated the time it took for the participants to respond to that stimuli, meaning that the time it took for them to perceive the stimuli, which was detection, and then the time it took for them to discriminate the stimuli, and then the time it now took for them to respond, which is the motor execution. So there's a graph that I'm going to attach where you can see this more clearly. So on top of that one, in now so the time taken to now calculate for the discrimination in itself, like the time taken to understand how long it took for the participant to discriminate the stimuli, will now be the reaction time for the go to no go task minus the reaction time for the simple task. So for discrimination, so discrimination equals to reaction time for go to no go task minus reaction time for simple task, because we know that two cognitive process, three cognitive process. I hope you're understanding the drift. Then for the time it took for the reaction time it took for participant to make the choice task, making a decision. What he did there was that he wanted to find the time it took to make a decision. And to find that time, deciding equals reaction time for choice minus reaction time for go to no go task. Remember that go to no go task has three cognitive processes, and then the choice task has four cognitive processes. So what he did was that, okay, when the participants finished their whole the whole time it took for them to decide, okay, red here, green here, it measures that. It now took the reaction time for the go to no go tax and then minus it from the reaction time for the choice. I hope we get it, but that was the concept. So that's how Ina found out how long it took for a decision to make. And I think the conclusion of his experiment was that it took one tenth of a second for a decision to be made. I hope you do understand that. So that basically what I just finished explaining was basically talking about the subtractive method and reaction time measurement. So that's basically all that was what all of that was all about. So let's move to the final part of Dunder's pioneering experiment, which was the stages of mental processing or stages of processing. Let's just call it stages of processing. That's what the final one was talking about. And basically, he had four stages of processing. And in the first stage of processing, it's called stimulus detection. Let me just run through the stages before I now explain what they are. So we have four stages of processing: stimulus detection, stimulus discrimination, stimulus detection, stimulus discrimination, stimulus selection, and then response execution. Stimulus detection, stimulus discrimination, stimulus detection, stimulus discrimination, response selection, and response execution. So those are the four stages of processing: selection, discrimination, detection, discrimination, response selection, and response execution. Let's not forget that. So we have four stages of processing: response detection, sorry, stimulus detection, stimulus discrimination, response selection, and response execution. Those are the four stages of processing. So for the stimulus detection, it was basically just talking about the time taken it took for an individual to identify a stimulus, and then the to perceive or identify a stimulus. That's basically what stimulus detection was all about. Then for the second one, which was stimulus discrimination, it is the time taken to distinguish between different stimulus. Like I said, red and green light, the time taken it takes to distinguish between those two different stimulus. Then we have response selection, which is the time taken to choose an appropriate response, deciding. Time taken to choose an appropriate response. And then the fourth stage of processing is response execution, time taken to initiate the motor response. So I hope that we understand all that concerns Donders pioneering experiment. Next, we're going to be talking about William Wundt's laboratory. Moving on, we'll be talking about Wundt's psychology experiment, and we may have heard of him before because he was regarded as the father of experimental psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, and he introduced the first formal laboratory for psychological research at the University of Leipzig, Germany in 1879. So basically, what Wundt was trying to do was trying to study the mind in a controlled setting. I mean, we've done a few experiments, so we know how the laboratory or controlled setting is, where we vary the independent variable and then try and find its effect on the dependent variable. So that was basically what Wundt was trying to do in his psychology experiment. He basically focused on introspection, and he basically his experimental researches marked the beginning of psychology as an independent scientific study. So it was not just subjective, where people were just, or like philosophy, where people try to say, oh, it's subjective experience, and people are trying to. So um, William Wundt tried to study psychology scientifically, like by the whole scientific process, by reproducing results and all of that. So his goal was to study the structure of the mind and its processes using scientific method, using rigorous scientific method. He believed that psychology should focus on conscious experience and that mental processes could be studied experimentally. So like I said earlier, what Wundt was trying to do was that he was trying to study the mind scientifically and say that okay, the mind should not just be an abstract concept. It should be something that we can study scientifically, where we can reproduce the same results and all of that. Okay, so let's talk about the experimental method of Wundt. So basically, Wundt's experimental method was influenced by physiology, and there are certain features that marked his experimental approach, like the way he performed this experiment and how he did things when it came to performing this experiment. So let's talk about his experimental approach. So one of his experimental approach was that he used a controlled laboratory setting. That's number one. He used a controlled laboratory setting. So Wundt conducted experiments in controlled environments to eliminate external influences and ensure reproducibility. So what he was trying to say and do was that okay, he took all of these variables that he wanted to study, and then he studied them in a very controlled setting where he greatly reduced any external influences so that he could be sure that he's actually measuring these variables. So the second feature, I mean, the first feature that we've talked about for Wundt's experimental method was the controlled laboratory setting. And then the second feature that we're talking about is the stimulus response paradigm. So what he was doing was that he used carefully designed stimuli, e.g., light stimulus, to elicit measurable responses from participants. So what does that mean? In a stimulus response paradigm, it was always introducing stimuli to the participant and then observing how they responded to those stimuli. So, for example, now if you see a bright light, how are you going to respond? Are you going to respond by covering your eye? Are you going to respond by shining into the, like looking directly into the light and all of that? So, what's one of his key features for his experimental approach was that he ensured stimulus response paradigm. He was always introducing stimulus to his participant and then observing how they responded to that stimuli. All right. So the third feature of Wundt's experimental approach was qualitative measurement. So it was not enough for him to do this experiment in a controlled setting. It was not enough for him to use a stimulus response paradigm. He also quantitatively measured those results he got. So it was not enough for him to just say, okay, I've observed that this person covers their eye when they see a bright light. He said, okay, what is the reaction time it takes for this person to cover their eye? How many seconds? How many nanoseconds? How long does it take? So he was quantitatively trying to measure all of these observations that he noticed in a controlled laboratory experiment. So let's not forget the features that we're talking about. Number one is that it was a controlled laboratory setting. Number two was that it was a stimulus structured paradigm. Number three is quantitative measurement. Stimulus response paradigm, sorry, not stimulus structured paradigm. So it was a stimulus response paradigm. And then number three was a quantitative measurement. He was constantly quantitatively measuring his results, or the reaction or the responses that participants had to the stimuli that he presented to them. Okay, so Wundt emphasize the importance of measuring mental processes objectively, often using reaction times and under quantitative data. We've explained that earlier. So the first feature of Wundt's experimental approach is systematic variation. So he systematically varied experimental conditions to isolate specific mental processes and understand their relationships. So like we remember how it is when we are trying to perform experiments, where when we have different variables we want to study, we try to isolate these variables. So for example, now let's say we want to try and study concentration, or want to try and study mental processes relating to a specific task. We will notice that we are putting them in a laboratory where it's not too noisy, so they are not getting distracted. Like he tried to control these things, and he tried to say, okay, let me vary this thing. When I introduce noise, what's going to happen? When I introduce, or when I take out noise, what's going to happen? So he systematically varied different conditions to isolate specific variables. So that's what that means. All right, so I think we're already done talking about Wundt's experimental method. So basically, the objectives we have for discussing Wundt's psychological experiment is focus on experimental methods, which is number one, introspection as a primary method, structuralism, measurement of mental processes, and training the first generation of psychologists. So we're already done with one part. So we're moving on to introspection as a primary method. So you would know earlier where I mentioned where Wundt was basically trying to focus on conscious experience. And then what he did while focusing on conscious experience was to direct his attention to introspection. So Wundt's primary method for studying the mind was introspection. That was the primary method that he used when it came to studying mental processes or the mind in general. Or he also called it systematic self-observation. So he said his primary objective when it came to studying the mind was this primary method for studying the mind was introspection or systematic self-observation. So he called it either introspection or systematic self-observation. So however, Wundt's approach to introspection was highly structured and scientific, unlike informal introspection used in philosophy. So, for example, what this is saying was that when Wundt focused on introspection, or when Wundt tried to study introspection, he didn't just study it as per, okay, you come and tell me what you're thinking today, what's going within your mind today. He did it in a very structured and scientific manner, or almost experimental manner. So what he did do, so one of the things that Wundt did when he was studying introspection, or when he was studying the mind, sorry, when he was studying the mind through introspection, was that he used trained observers. He used trained observers. So it was not just that he just met any participant and then now asked them to now try and tell him what they were thinking. So he trained his observers, he trained his participants. So Wundt insisted that only highly trained individuals could perform introspection accurately. His participants underwent extensive training to describe their experience objectively. So what does that mean? It means that Wundt used trained observers, meaning that he didn't think that introspection could be done by just anybody. He felt that introspection had to be done by highly trained individuals, people that were trained to perform introspection, people that knew how to perform introspection accurately. So what he did was that even before he started to study these participants' introspection, he put them through extensive training to teach them how to introspect. So that's the one thing that about Wundt's primary method, like studying the mind through introspection. He made use of trained observers. The second one was that he focused on immediate experience. He focused on immediate experience. One was not trying to find out what was happening in the past with them. It was basically about that moment. So it was asking them to introspect about that moment, not about the past, that moment. So introspection was used to analyze the basic elements of conscious experience as they occurred rather than reflecting on past experience. So Wundt was not trying to say, okay, what happened 2 years ago and what did you feel about that? He was basically saying, okay, as all these events are unfolding in front of you, what are your introspective thoughts concerning them? So that's the second part. So the third part was structured reporting. So let's not forget the first part, he used trained observers. The second part, he focused on immediate responses. He focused on immediate experiences. The third part was that he used structured reporting when it came to studying the mind as true introspection. Let's not forget, Wundt tried to study the mind through introspection. And then how he did that was that he made use of trained observers. Sorry, he focused on immediate experiences and then he used structured reporting. So participants were required to describe their experience in precise, standardized terms, avoiding interpretations of subjective biases. So part of the training that he made participants go through was that he made them um he kind of like tried to standardize the reporting process. So it was not like, okay, you use different words. Everybody is saying, oh, I was sad. This person was saying, I was upset. This person is saying, I felt solemn. This person is saying this or that. So he made sure that the reporting was structured and that there was some form of standardization across participants. So that's what he did when he tried to study the mind using introspection. All right. But we need to also know that once focus of introspection as a way to study the mind had its limitation, and people did not agree with it because people still felt that the process of introspection was very subjective, and that no matter how you wanted to standardize introspection, it could never be the most perfect way to studying the mind. So people rejected it as a primary method for psychology. All right, so let's move to the next part in Wundt's sorry, in Wundt's findings on Wundt's experimental method. And the next part is structuralism. And in structuralism, Wundt tried to approach psychology through structuralism or with structuralism. And what he was trying to say, or what that school of thought of structuralism was trying to say, was that the mind had to be broken down into parts to be studied. So it's more like, okay, the sum of the parts is greater than the sum of the whole. Because you remember that there was the whole Gestalt principle was talking about how the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But with structuralism, the school of thought tried to analyze the structure of the mind by breaking it down into its basic components. So what structuralism was trying to do was that they'll try to analyze the mind by breaking it down into its components. So let's say we're breaking it down into components of like feelings, thinking, other kind of thing. So that's basically what structuralism was trying to do. So what were the basic or the key ideas of structuralism? The key ideas of structuralism includes elemental analysis. So Wundt believed that the mind could be understood by identifying its fundamental elements such as sensations, feelings, and images. Like I earlier said, like when you're breaking the mind into individual components or smaller components. So basically, what structuralism was talking about was that, or one of the key ideas of structuralism was elemental analysis, meaning that by if you wanted to understand the mind, you have to break it down into smaller bits, like feelings, like images, like sensations, all of that. So the second part of structuralism, second key idea of structuralism is conscious experiences, and structuralism focused on the study of conscious experiences, emphasizing how these elements combine to form complex mental processes. So structuralism was basically focusing on conscious experiences, things that we can I will not say hold, but like things that we can perceive. So it's not just about the subconscious that is underneath us. Because if you remember that plane of consciousness where the conscious mind is above and then the subconscious mind is slightly in the middle, then the unconscious mind is way more deeper. So that's what in structuralism was basically talking about the um the conscious experiences that we experience as individuals. So one of the criticism of structuralism was that people felt that it was too reductionist, like it was too simplified and it was too reductionist was basically means that these things were just too simplified to fully encapsulate what the mind was all about. So it said that with structuralism, they were not really thinking about the functions or the adaptive aspects of mental processes. They're just trying to say, okay, break down these mental processes, and then we are going to find out how the mind works. But there was a lot of criticism by saying that structuralism was too reductified, and it was such a reductionist approach. Okay, so it was that criticism that led to the rise of functionalism and behaviorism. But we're not going to be talking about that today, but that's all about structuralism as it compares to William Wundt. So the next one that we're going to talk about concerning William Wundt's William Wundt psychology experiment, rather, sorry, is the measurement of mental processes. So Wundt was deeply interested in quantifying mental processes. So he built on the work of Donders, like we've talked about earlier, and his experiments often involved measuring reaction times and other physiological responses. So you remember that we talked about Donders and how Donders was the first person to try to study the mind scientifically. So Wundt now started to build upon Donders' work, because you remember that Donders tried to quantify or measure mental processes based with reaction times. So Wundt now used reaction times and then used other psychological responses or physiological responses rather. All right. So he did reaction time experiments. Building on Dunder's work, Wundt used reaction times to study the speed of mental processes such as perception and decision making. Number two was temporal resolution, and Wundt's experiments demonstrated that different mental processes take different amounts of time, providing insight into the sequence and complexity of cognitive processes. So, what temporal resolution was basically talking about, according to Wundt's experiments, was that mental processes took different amounts of time. So it means that the mental process for thinking is going to be different from the mental process for trying to carry your school bag. The mental processes for let's say for drinking water is going to be different from the mental processes for eating. So that's one of the things that Wundt was trying to experimentally observe. All right, so we're talking about measurement of mental processes, and under this measurement of mental processes, we know that he did reaction time measurement or reaction time experiments to try and quantify how long it took to perceive and to make decisions. And then he did the second experiment was temporal resolution, where he found out that different mental processes took different time. And then the third experiment was psychophysics. Wundt was influenced by psychophysics, a field that studies the relationship between physical stimuli and psychological sensations. He applied these principles to measure how stimuli are perceived and processed. So the third experiment that is under the measurement of mental processes that won't try to do is psychophysics. So the three experiments under measurement of mental processes, according to Wundt, is reaction time experiment, temporal resolution, and psychophysics. All right. So I think we understand that part. So we're moving to the final version or the final part in Wundt's psychology experiment, and that's relating to training the first generation of psychologists. So you remember that Wundt's laboratory in 1879 was the first laboratory or first psychological laboratory that was ever built or introduced. So many people tried, like studied under Wundt, like so many people that went on to do great things in the field studied under Wundt. And Wundt's laboratory at Leipzig became a hub for psychological research and education. He trained many students who went on to become influential psychologists, spreading his methods and ideas worldwide. Key aspects of his training program includes rigorous methodology, interdisciplinary approach, and global influence. And then he left his legacy. So basically, what rigorous methodology was basically about was that Wundt emphasized the importance of rigorous experimental methods and scientific rigor in psychological research. So you remember how we talked about how he was very, very specific about using controlled settings. He was specific about having his participants trained when he was even using introspection as a tool to measure the mind and all of that. So he had like a rigorous methodology to studying the mind. So also he also made use of interdisciplinary approach. His training incorporated elements of physiology, philosophy, and experimental psychology, providing students with a broad foundation. So his students had like exposure to other fields in other like that helped them do their research. Remember that he also made use of stimuli. So let's say he's trying to see, okay, is there a physiological response to certain stimuli? Does the body, like for example, now a physiological response to a very bright light can be trying to protect your eyes and by covering your eyes, like all of that kind of thing. All right. So the third one was that Wundt's laboratory had global influence. So many of Wundt's students, such as Edward Titchener was the person who brought structuralism to the US, and then we have Stanley Hall, who established the first psychology or first laboratory in the US too. So we that's just showing us how Wundt's global influence was like and how it really, really greatly contributed to the field. So I think that's all that we're going to be talking about on Wundt. So the next person that we're going to be talking about is Ebbinghaus. Hermann, Herman. Then Ebbinghaus is Ebbinghaus. So basically, Hermann Ebbinghaus was trying to study memory, and then he was trying to study memory outside of previous he was just trying to study it on a plain state. He didn't want to study memory as a okay previous memory and all of that. So that's how we introduced the concept of nonsense syllables. So he was not trying to say, okay, remember something from the past, remember something from 2 weeks ago, remember something from yesterday. So he tried to now introduce the concept of nonsense syllables. All right, so let's talk about him briefly. So Hermann Ebbinghaus was a German psychologist, and he conducted some of the first systematic experiments on memory using rigorous quantitative methods. His work laid the foundation for modern memory research and introduced several key concepts that remain influential today. Ebbinghaus sought to study memory in a controlled scientific manner, free from influence of prior knowledge or associations. To achieve this, he developed innovative methods and concepts, including the use of nonsense syllables, the learning curve, the forgetting curve, the spacing effect, and concept of savings in relearning. So let's talk about the use of nonsense syllables, because I think I've already kind of briefly explained the part of um, Ebbinghaus's reasoning when it comes to using nonsense syllables for studying the memory processes. So what Ebbinghaus wanted to do was that he didn't want to study memory based off prior experience or prior learning experience. He wanted like a fresh slate. So that's where he now introduced the concept of nonsense syllables. So basically, what are nonsense syllables? Nonsense syllables, Ebbinghaus actually was the person that invented nonsense syllables, and nonsense syllables are like pure form. He used the reason why he invented nonsense syllables, like we have established earlier, was that he wanted to study memory in a pure form. We've established that before. So nonsense syllables are three-letter combination consisting of a vowel sandwiched in between two consonants. So what are nonsense syllables? Nonsense syllable consists of one vowel in the middle of two consonants. So it's very random. It can be ZAW. It's just extremely random. That's the concept of nonsense syllables. All right. So an example of nonsense syllables can be ZOF, WUX, BIJ. So the idea was that three letters, they will have a vowel in the middle and then two consonants. They don't necessarily mean anything. All right. So these syllables are meaningless and have no prior associations, allowing Ebbinghaus to study how memory works without the interference of semantic content. Like I said, he didn't want any background knowledge, he didn't want any of that to interfere with the memory experiment that he was currently carrying out. All right. So the advantage of nonsense syllables was that he provided a standardized way to measure memory. He allowed for precise control over the material being learned. Like I said, he wanted to study memory in its pure form. So he introduced nonsense syllables in a way whereby, okay, nobody's trying to, it just reduced the subjectivity. I mean, if you're trying to remember something you don't know, something you're just learning that doesn't necessarily mean anything, you know that, okay, that is the focus of the experiment compared to subjective memory recalls. Because if you remember when we talked about schema theory, about how we talked about how schemas can influence memory recall and all of that. So use of this nonsense syllable removed contextual meanings, it removes semantic associations and all of that. So the second part that we're going to be talking about is the learning curve. We've talked about the nonsense syllables. Now we're talking about the learning curve. So Ebbinghaus studied how repetition affects memory by measuring the number of trials required to learn a list of nonsense syllables to perfection. The learning curve. How long does it take for an individual to learn these nonsense syllables? That's basically what the learning curve was trying to get. So the learning curve was like, okay, how many times do I have to repeat this nonsense syllables for me to learn it? So for example, now let's say I have a three list of nonsense syllables: ZOF, WX, and let's say CIK. So how long does it take me to learn ZOF, WX, and CIK? So how many trials do I have to take? How many times do I have to talk to myself about it, recall it, and all of that in trying to learn it to perfection, to the point where I fully and truly understand it? That's what the learning curve was about. So we said it. So being able to record the entire list without errors. We have to also remember that with the learning curve, it's not just about recalling just one of the nonsense syllables. It's about recalling a list of nonsense syllables. I think if you remember, I think in year 2 or year 3, we did the forgetting curve experiment where we actually tried to learn certain of these syllables. And I think there were about 10 of them in a list. So the learning curve was how long it would take you for you to perfectly recall those 10 syllables in the perfect order. That's what the learning curve is talking about. So he plotted this data to create the learning curve, which shows the relationship between practice and memory performance. So the learning curve was trying to show the relationship between practice and memory performance. All right. So were the key findings for the learning curve? Memory improves with repeated practice, but the rate of improvement slows over time. What does that mean? Memory would always improve with repeated practice, but the rate of improvement slows over time. What are we trying to say? He's saying that memory would always improve with repeated practice, but the improvement will be slowing down. So for example, now as I'm trying to learn a particular list of nonsense syllables, the first time I try to learn that nonsense syllables, I might recall only 3 of them out of the 10 lists. So the next time I'm trying to learn it again, I might recall maybe 4 of them. That's already like a one shift. And then the next time I'm trying to learn it, I may recall maybe 3 of them. So it says that as you try to improve, like as you try to repeat a particular thing you're trying to recall, like as you try to practice, exactly as you try to, the number of times it takes you to practice, it now starts to diminish as time goes on. So it gets to a point where, if you remember a curve, let's say a learning curve, where it's first steep at the beginning, is very steep at the beginning. It's taking a lot of effort, it's taking a lot of time, it's taking you so much cognitive load and cognitive energy to be able to recall that thing. So over time, that curve starts to plateau, and is in that plateau that it talks about how improvement will slow over time. So in the beginning, you can make very big leaps of improvement, but then towards the end, you're now making smaller or lesser leaps of improvement. Like the improvement is not as great as it was in the initial stages. So that's basically one of his key findings, that memory improves with repeated practice, but the rate of improvement would always slow over time. So the second key finding was that the learning curve is steep at first, indicating rapid gains, but flattens as mastery is approached. That's what I just talked about now. So if we look at an image of the learning curve, remember the learning curve, how, let's say we have our y-axis and then our x-axis, and then in the first few trials, the curve there is very, very steep. meaning that you're gaining grounds, like you're gaining a lot of grounds. You're feeling like, oh my God, I understand this. But then as time goes on and as trials go on, and you start to gain mastery, the learning curve starts to steeping out. It becomes more like a plateau. So it's going, this is the y-axis, this is the x-axis. So it's going very steep at first, and then it kind of plateaus out. That's what it means, that that the learning curve is steep at first, and then as you gain mastery, it becomes more flattened out and plateaued. So the implication of the learning curve is that it demonstrated that memory is a function of repetition and practice, and he highlighted the importance of effort and time in learning. So memory is a function of repetition and practice, and then it highlighted the importance of effort and time in learning, meaning that the more you repeat something and the more you practice, greater you have the greater chance you have to recall that memory. That's what that means. And then it says that the more effort and the more time you put into putting something into your memory, the um basically effort and time is important, and in terms of memory recall. All right, so let's move in terms of learning, not me saying memory recall, that effort and time is important when it comes to learning. Do you understand? All right. So let's move to the forgetting curve. And basically, one of Ebbinghaus' most famous contribution is the forgetting curve, which describes how memory retention declines over time without reinforcement. He memorized list of nonsense syllables and then tests his recall at various intervals to measure how he had forgotten. So what is the forgetting curve trying to talk about? Forgetting curve is just basically saying that you see this memory thing, once you are learning something, you are going to forget it at some point if there is no reinforcement. So if you're not reinforcing that learning, your brain is going to, because if we like the video where we talked about so where the other tutor talked about memory and how they are like processes or things that can influence memory decay, like things like decay and like things that can influence forgetting, like decay and the rest. So basically, the forgetting curve is saying that if you don't reinforce me as a memory, I'm going to diminish over time. So, for example, what that means is that if after a period of time, let's say after one day, you ask me again, how many, what, give me the list of the 10 nonsense syllables. Likelihood is that I will still remember 10 of them. So if after a week I have not gone to that material at all, I have not even checked those nonsense syllables, I don't have any form of reinforcement at all for those syllables, likelihood that the next time you ask me after a week, I would have forgotten at least two or three of them. So basically, what the forgetting curve, which is one of Ebbinghaus's greatest contribution or most famous contribution, not greatest, the most famous one, is that memory retention would decline over time without reinforcement. Okay, so we've talked about that. So what are the key findings of the forgetting curve? The key findings of the forgetting curve is that forgetting occurs rapidly at first with a significant drop in retention within the first hour or day. So it means that when you try to learn a material without reinforcement, like let's say you've tried to learn it, you've repeated it, you will first forget. Like memory will first occur rapidly at first with a significant drop in retention within the first hour or day. So the rate of forgetting slows over time with some information retained for long periods. Then the third one is the curve follows a logarithmic pattern, showing that most forgetting happens soon after learning. All right, so let's just go over the key findings again. I think I'm going to try and attach the forgetting curve and also the learning curve so that we have a better understanding. So it's not just an abstract concept. So with the forgetting curve, with the forgetting with the forgetting curve, it first says that forgetting occurs rapidly at first with a significant drop in retention in the first hour or first day, and then the rate of forgetting slows over time with some information retained for longer periods. And then the third one is the curve follows a logarithmic pattern. Logarithmic meaning log in mathematics, logarithmic pattern, showing that most forgetting happens soon after learning. So meaning that when you first learn when you learn a material, most of the forgetting will happen immediately you learn it. Do you get? That's what. So don't be surprised anytime maybe you read finish. You just finish reading and then you realize that, oh, what did I just read? I can't remember. So you remember that point when you're trying to read and then you're writing, you now try and call it to yourself. You now try to recall it again, like, what's going on? What's going on? So that's just basically the forgetting curve in action. All right, so let's talk about, okay, what are the implications even before we go to spacing effect? What is the implication of the forgetting curve? The implication of the forgetting curve is that it demonstrates the importance of repetition and review to combat forgetting, and it highlighted the fragility of memory over time. So basically, forgetting curve, the implication was that when it comes to memory, memory is fragile over time. So the way you're going to remember a material you learned 3 days ago is going to be different from the way you remember a material that was learned 10 years ago. When it comes to memory and time, they're not friends. You always forget with time. And then it also now tells us that it now demonstrates the importance of review and repetition to combat memory. You remember that I was talking about when you learn the material and then the first time you write it out first when you're reading, and then you try to recall it and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't remember what I just read. But then the more you now start to talk about it, the more you now teach it to yourself, the more you now repeat that sentence. Or let's say you're trying to define something. So let's say you're defining let's say, okay, is it matter that, okay, let's say we want to define what matter is. I'm gonna say matter is the name of any person, animal, place, or thing. Matter is the name of, and so the first time you write it down, you might not have remembered it, but the more you repeat that concept and the more that you review it, the more you combat forgetting. I hope you get that. So let's talk about the spacing effect. All right. So Ebbinghaus discovered that memory retention is better when learning is distributed over time rather than crammed into a single session. This phenomenon is known as the spacing effect or distributed practice. Let's not forget, spacing effect is also called distributed practice. And what did Hermann Ebbinghaus discover when it comes to the spacing effect? He's saying that when you want to remember something, it is better for you to space the learning sessions into different parts, or space the learning sessions compared to when you try to cram your learning sessions into one session. So, and because discovered that memory retention is better when learning is distributed over time rather than crammed into a single session. Let's not forget. And because discovered that memory retention is better when learning is distributed over time compared to when learning is crammed into a single session. So that is called the spacing effect or the distributed practice. All right. So what are the key findings of the spacing effect? One key finding of spacing effect is that spaced repetition leads to more durable and long-lasting memories compared to massed practice, which is cramming. All right, let's go over that again. Spaced repetition leads to more durable and long-lasting memories compared to massed practice. All right, so he's saying that you would remember more and your memory will be more stronger and more durable when you space your learning compared to when you mass practice, when you try to get everything in one learning session. That is which means that repetition greater than cramming. All right, so let's go to the next key finding of the spaced repetition. So it says that the optimal spacing interval depends on the material and the individual. So what does that mean? It means that for person A, the spaced repetition that they need might be 5 minutes. For person B, the spaced repetition that they need might be 20 minutes. For person C, the spaced repetition that they need can be 2 days. So it says that when it comes to spacing effect, it is always dependent on the individual and then the material that is trying to be learned. That's what the spacing effect basically talks about. So, all right, so let's talk about the implications of the spacing effect. One of the implications of the spacing effect is that it provided evidence for the benefits of spaced learning, which is now widely used in education and training. And then secondly, it demonstrated that memory is not just a function of repetition, but also of timing. So what the spacing effect or the distributed practice made us understand was that memory is not just dependent on repetition, like Ebbinghaus had already discovered before, but it is also dependent on timing. That's what the spaced repetition is talking about. So let's move to the last, second to the last, because I think we've not talked about the quantitative approach. So let's talk about the savings in relearning, what savings in relearning means and what it's talking about. So Ebbinghaus introduced the concept of savings in relearning, which measures how easier it is to relearn material that has been previously learned and forgotten. He compared the time or effort required to relearn a list of nonsense syllables to the time or effort required to learn it for the first time. So savings in relearning, what basically savings in relearning is talking about is that For a material that you've learned before and then you've forgotten, it is easier for you to remember that material compared to a material that you've not read at all. And you have to remember that when it comes to Hermann Hemingway's experiment, memory experiment, he was basically using nonsense syllables. So don't think of this as your material, your book, or anything. You're talking about the nonsense syllables. So he's saying that if an individual has learned a particular list of nonsense syllables before and then they have forgotten those nonsense syllables, it takes a lesser amount of time and effort to now relearn that nonsense list of nonsense syllables again. That's what is called savings in relearning. Savings in relearning, don't forget. All right. So what are the key findings of savings in relearning? He said even when material is forgotten, some traces of it remain in the memory, making relearning faster than initial learning. The second key finding is that the amount of savings depends on the strength of the original memory and the time elapsed since learning. The amount of savings, meaning the traces in memory that still remains, is dependent on the strength of the original memory and the time elapsed since learning. So it means that for the strength of the memory traces that you still have after you've learned and forgotten the material is dependent on how long it has taken you. Meaning that something of 2 years ago will be different from something of 10 years ago. And then the strength of the original memory. How well did you learn the nonsense syllable? How well did you learn the material the first time? All right. What's the implication of this? The implication of this is that it demonstrated that forgetting is not complete. So residual memory persists, and then he also demonstrated that he provided a quantitative way to measure the strength of memory traces. So when it comes to the savings in relearning, one of the implications was that he says that forgetting is not final. Once you forget the material, once you forget something, it doesn't mean that you totally forget it and then you have nothing to do with it at all. It means that there's still a kind of residual mapping or residual trace of that memory that will still remain in your mind. All right, let's talk about the final part. And the final part that we're going to talk about when it comes to Hermann Hem, because I don't even know whether that pronunciation is correct, but Ebbinghaus, I think we've spelled it before, so don't make mistake. Anyways, Ebbinghaus was one of the first psychologists to apply rigorous quantitative methods to the study of memory. He meticulously recorded and analyzed data from his experiments using mathematical techniques to model memory processes. So that's the quantitative approach to memory. It means that Ebbinghaus was not just studying this thing and then writing the observations down. He was quantitatively analyzing this feedback he was getting from this experiment. He was quantitatively analyzing them, and then he now created a model memory process, meaning that he used this thing to create a model memory process. So what are the key contributions to that? So what are the key contributions to Ebbinghaus's memory quantitative approach to memory? Was that he developed precise methods for measuring memory performance. For example, number of repetitions, recall accuracy, time intervals. And then he used statistical analysis to identify patterns and relationship in memory data. And then he introduced the concept of memory as a measurable phenomenon, paving the way for future experimental research. So we are basically done with talking about Ebbinghaus, we've talked about Donders, we've talked about William Wundt, and next we'll be talking about the last three, but that's not for today. So see you next time. Bye.